Greetings and welcome to Illinois in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Greg Bishop, Illinois editor at Franklin News Foundation, publisher of the Center Square Newswire service. This week in Illinois in Focus, the Center Square reporter Jim Talamonte and I are going to discuss the latest debates around public safety, the state's end of money bond and migrant sanctuary policies, the latest in sentencing of the ComEd 4 defendants, and the politics around political maps. All of that and more when we return.
Some people would call him a loser. He ran for state office. He was beaten. He started a business. He failed. He ran for Congress. He lost. He was nominated for vice president. He lost again. But he knew only those who never tried are the real losers. And Abraham Lincoln was no loser. Persistence. Pass it on. From the Foundation for a Better Life at values.com.
Welcome back to Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop. Last weekend, the arrest of a Mexican national by immigration officials rekindled the debates about the intersection of Illinois' no-cash bail law and the state's migrant sanctuary policies. Joining us to discuss this is Jim Talamonte, a reporter from the Center Square. Jim, Trump administration border czar Tom Homan said this week they're going to flood the zone of migrant sanctuary cities. Came after the weekend arrest of Jose Luis Mendoza-Gonzalez by ICE officials Saturday. Mendoza-Gonzalez was released in April on no cash bail after being arrested by local authorities for concealing a body. Jim, where do we start with this story?
Yeah, it's really involved. You know, he was arrested in Chicago. His residence, well, he's a Mexican national, but his residence was in Waukegan. That's where the body of 37-year-old Megan Bos was found after a search that went on for at least several weeks. And she was found dead, and her body essentially submerged in bleach. And so Mendoza-Gonzalez was charged with 4 felonies, including concealing a death, abusing a corpse, and obstructing justice. Not charged with murder or something that would be under Illinois Safety Act detainable. So the judge by law was essentially required to let Mendoza-Gonzalez go. He also apparently didn't qualify as someone who was a serious flight risk, even though, you know, I talked with Antioch Mayor Scott Gardner. He said, well, if I was this guy, I'd have been out of here. I'd, put him back in Mexico to elude authorities, I think is what he was suggesting. So, quite a complicated case, but he's allowed to walk and is then free for quite some time. Until ICE scooped him up in Chicago, apparently without incident. And so he's being held by ICE, but apparently back at the Lake County Jail, according to an Immigration and Customs Enforcement spokesperson.
And this is interesting because at first, when he was arrested in April, the no cash bail provision, a judge said that's why they let Mendoza-Gonzalez go, is because of the non-detainable offenses that are spelled out in the Pretrial Fairness Act. A lot of people know about the Safety Act. It was passed during a lame duck session in January of 2021. It had the Pretrial Fairness Act in there, and part of that was challenged in the courts and didn't actually go into effect until September of 2023 after the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that it could go into effect. But ultimately that, the law enforcement community saying it's tying their hands and it's hurting morale. It's causing police to, question why they're doing the job if the guy that they just arrested and chased and maybe got beat up even, is out on no cash bail. Almost instantly. So that's the no cash bail provision. But Mendoza-Gonzalez was a Mexican national, apparently in the country illegally. And the state's migrant sanctuary policies prevented local law enforcement from communicating, hey, we just arrested a non-citizen for concealing a body. ICE, come get them. That didn't happen in the state of Illinois, apparently.
Yeah, it did happen. And it's interesting that Megan Bos was from Antioch, and her mom has come out and said this Safety Act needs to change. We don't want other families to suffer what we've been through, where this guy, and she admitted, we don't know, the investigation is still ongoing. We don't know, his role beyond concealing the death and the what he's charged with. So he's not charged with murder or attempted murder, anything like that at this point, but the investigation is still active. So, but it's interesting that federal immigration officials have been stepping up their enforcement, it seems, in sanctuary cities. And an analysis by the Chicago Tribune using a deportation data project information found that the arrests in and around Chicago by ICE have increased significantly since Donald Trump's return to office. I don't think anyone's surprised by that, given that that's, one of the key issues that he was elected on, and given that these types of arrests apparently were not happening as frequently under his predecessor, Joe Biden.
Definitely something we're going to continue to monitor as, again, Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, said they're going to flood the zone here in sanctuary cities and states. Governor J.B. Pritzker saying that ICE is harming Illinoisans and they're not welcome in Illinois. You even have Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson pushing back, essentially saying that the federal government's not serious, but the mayor was making those comments to questions during a news conference where he said he's going to do a full force of government approach to crack down on smoking on public transit. But asked about, the possibility of flooding the zone or full force of government of ICE officials coming to enforce federal immigration law, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson said that that's not serious. Interesting to try to square those two things up there, Jim.
Yeah, and then the mayor all along, there's been no nuance from him really on this. He has been anti-ICE, anti-immigration enforcement, whereas the governor, in contrast, has been a little more nuanced. He has said, he's told you at times, Greg, that we do want violent criminals out of here. We do want that. But then after being asked about this case, he's also saying about the increased enforcement, the flooding the zone, as Tom Homan said. Well, we don't want that. So he's kind of playing both sides, somewhat in the middle, which not to say he's waffled necessarily, because he has said several times he wants violent people out, whereas Brandon Johnson has not said that. The mayor of Chicago has essentially he's saying he has used the terminology is used at times with regard to the Trump administration has been pretty, especially on this issue, has been pretty intense, corrupt and inhumane and so on and so forth. Of course, the governor has also used very harsh rhetoric against the president. But on this issue, there's been at least a little bit of nuance from Pritzker, whereas from Johnson, really, there hasn't been. And he has not, even in the face of some of the criticism he's faced at city council meetings from members of the community about prioritizing migrants over citizens, he just has not shown any interest at all in changing policy in terms of sanctuary city.
And Homan making clear that ICE is going to have to do what these sanctuary jurisdictions don't want them to do, and that is to go into the neighborhoods, because these jurisdictions are not cooperating with ICE when they have a criminal illegal alien in their local jails. So instead of going to the local jail and arresting that criminal illegal alien and processing them through federal immigration authorities, ICE says they're going to have to, quote, flood the zone. So we'll be watching that, of course. This is Illinois in Focus. I'm Greg Bishop, joined by Jim Talamonte. You can read those stories and so many more at thecentersquare.com. Jim, we're recording this Thursday, July 24th, and you're still in court. You've been in that courtroom quite a bit the past few months. What were you doing there today?
Michael McClain, the longtime associate of former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. You may recall McClain during the trial, during the Madigan trial, was not convicted on any of the 23 counts that the two men were accused of. Madigan was convicted on 10 counts and sentenced to 7.5 years in prison and had a $2.5 million fine imposed. But McClain went through two of these federal trials related to corruption, related to the same essential scheme, the quote-unquote Madigan enterprise, involving favors for the longtime Illinois House Speaker in exchange for legislation favorable to ComEd. Those were some of the counts. There were also counts involving a Chinatown land parcel, a state board position, and so on in the Madigan trial. The ComEd 4 case was focused on ComEd. and 4 people were convicted, including Michael McLean, Madigan's longtime associate. Once upon a time, he was a state rep. He took over the state rep position from his father and served 10 years in the Illinois House, then became a lobbyist, went straight from that into lobbying, as so many Illinois politicians do. Well, McLean was essentially Madigan's right-hand man through what prosecutors say was this intricate scheme. In fact, one of the prosecutors, Amar Bachu, referred to Madigan and McLean as grand masters of corruption. While McLean, not found guilty in the Madigan trial, was found guilty with 3 others of bribery, conspiracy, and falsifying records. The conviction came down in 2023. There were several delays. Some counts were dropped. But today, sentencing finally came for McLean. 2 years. I should say sentencing came Thursday for McLean. 2 years. No fine involved. McLean's attorney said he's been economically ruined by this. Unlike Madigan, who had thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions in his campaign fund, McLean didn't have that. And so these 2 trials have taken quite a toll on him economically. He's 77 years old. His attorney said he's on at least a dozen medications essentially to keep him alive. So a little different, even though McLean's younger by a few years. The medical condition seemed to be a factor. But the judge in this case, Ane Shaw, imposed a 2-year prison sentence plus 6 years supervised release, essentially probation, for McLean. And this again involved a scheme of exchanging bribes, hiring Madigan allies for little work or no work jobs for ComEd through a subcontractor, an elaborate scheme, in exchange for legislation in favor of ComEd.
Yeah, federal prosecutor said it was nearly a decade-long scheme.
That's what prosecutors said. That was the length of the investigation. We believe this was going on well before that decade began. So really going back in time, and there were recordings, I think, going back to 2008. So, and a whole bunch of material, just an incredible amount of recordings and documents and texts and emails, and ComEd in a deferred prosecution agreement agreed to pay $200 million and then admitted essentially to its participation in this scheme. So former ComEd CEO Ann Pramaggiore was sentenced to 2 years in prison, ordered to pay a $750,000 fine. ComEd lobbyist John Hooker got 1.5 years behind bars. And then there's one left. The last defendant is contract lobbyist Jay Doherty. He was once president of the City Club of Chicago, and his office there was raided as part of this investigation. His sentencing is August 5th. Prosecutors have kind of suggested that he was kind of the least culpable in the scheme. So we'll see how his sentence plays out then. But McLean, a key guy, we've seen a lot of him in federal court, as his attorney said, really over the last 6 years.
It's pretty remarkable, especially to have a date on the calendar when they're not just getting sentenced, but they're going to have to report to prison. You've got former Speaker Michael Madigan serving that 7.5-year prison term starting October?
October 13th for Madigan, October 30th for McLean. And Judge Shaw was going to start it earlier, but for McLean's health. He's going through some cardiac therapy, and so his is not set to begin till October 30th. So, yeah, and this was, as both the judge and the prosecutor said, this affected the highest levels of Illinois government, corrupted the highest levels of Illinois government, or I think as the judge said, damaged the highest levels of Illinois government, and the highest levels of a publicly regulated, publicly traded utility in ComEd. And we still haven't seen here in Illinois, we've talked about this before, the kind of reforms many would like to see to prevent this kind of stuff from happening again in terms of both the Illinois legislature and ComEd and other utilities.
And you got to think about some of the issues you've brought up here that Republicans are looking to, bring about some ethics reforms that they haven't had much luck in doing. And one includes not allowing for elected officials to use their campaign coffers for defending against these types of charges. Something that Madigan did quite a bit, but there's a whole host of other ethics proposals that really haven't advanced, something we'll continue to watch and monitor at thecentersquare.com. I'm Greg Bishop, joined by Jim Talamonte. This is Illinois in Focus. Sticking with politics here and, questions of, the types of things that happen in a state like Illinois. We, of course, had the 2020 census. We had the loss of a congressional seat because of continued population decline. They had to draw new maps. And Democrats control the legislature in Illinois. So they drew maps, and those were approved and signed by the governor in 2021, and got an F grade back then from civic organizations like Common Cause, saying that these maps that Illinois Democrats drew were gerrymandered, and Republicans have sued a couple of different times trying to change the maps, or at least the map making process. And you got to go back even to the days of Bruce Rauner, and before then, when there was an attempt to try to force a map making commission independent of politicians drawing the lines. But that effort failed to advance after it was challenged in the courts with attorneys linked to former Illinois House Speaker Michael Madigan. So despite all of those efforts to try to bring about fair map making process, Illinois has that map in place that was drawn by Democrats and approved by Democrats, seeming to force Republicans into jurisdictions where Democrats would be safe otherwise. This all came back to surface after apparently Texas is eyeing possibly changing their legislative maps in in the middle of the decade here. Something states can do, but Jim, this is sparking debate about gerrymandering and possibly seeing Republicans in Texas craft a map that could give them some advantage into the 2026 election. Governor J.B. Pritzker didn't like that too much.
Yeah, it's remarkable, right? I mean, I think about 10 years ago, there was some controversy, and one of the leading congressional members of the Texas delegation was involved in discussions over maps and districts and that kind of thing. But Illinois takes the cake, and there's a reason Illinois gets an F. And when you say Illinois Democrats drew the maps, well, who was 2021? Who was still in? That was the last year Mike Madigan was in place. So you certainly know he played a key role. He and his people did in those maps being drawn, and he was certainly involved in some of the previous questionable mapping of Illinois districts. I mean, you look at our legislative maps, and they look like some kind of jigsaw puzzle with all kinds of crazy, these are not nice little blocks here and there. Yeah. These are, I mean, here in Chicago, Chuy Garcia, the former district of Luis Gutierrez, it's got a thin little strip on the west side of Chicago, but it connects a large Puerto Rican neighborhood, Gutierrez was Puerto Rican, and the large Little Village Mexican neighborhood, which Garcia belongs to. And it's just remarkable, the shapes of some of these districts, both the congressional district and state.
In Central Illinois, the 13th congressional district, where Nikki Budzinski, a Democrat, is the congressperson from, it starts in East St. Louis, wraps up some larger metropolitan areas, including Springfield, and then includes just the strip of I-55 before it goes up to parts of Decatur and parts of other college town. Obviously not a square district as you might see in a state like Iowa, for instance. And the idea that Texas is going to redraw their maps, Pritzker called that cheating. He called that cheating. But Pritzker's being called a hypocrite by Illinois Republicans.
Yeah, you talked to C.D. Davidsmeyer of the Illinois House about this, and yeah, I mean, talk about hard to argue with Davidsmeyer on this one. Just given again that you would think the governor might have stayed away from this one, just knowing the Illinois history and knowing the ethics questions that he has faced about the state of our political mess here in Illinois, but he went right in, and I guess because it's Republicans, it's not okay. But boy, if Texas can duplicate Illinois' map, that would be quite an accomplishment. Not a good one, perhaps, but we'll see how Common Cause maybe grades the Texas maps if they are in fact changed and do look anything like Illinois', because ours, boy, you look at it and you understand why we get an F for political mapping.
Yeah, it's something Republicans say is hard to make sense of, especially as, Trump got 45% of the votes in the most recent presidential election, but that percentage does not translate to how many Republicans are, say, in the Illinois House. So those types of things are always interesting. We'll be watching that. Jim, the economic picture in Illinois, obviously, just looked at some metropolitan areas. Unemployment's down across the states, and East St. Louis and the St. Louis metro area actually saw the lowest unemployment rate rate for it in quite some time at like 3.5%. But the state still lags the national average for unemployment. Is the governor's efforts to try to build quantum something that's going to reverse that?
Well, he thinks so. He is a self-described quantum geek, and he has handed out hundreds of millions in dollars in tax incentives to quantum corporations. He's been critical of President Trump for what Pritzker says is giving tax breaks to billionaires, and mentioned the names Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. But Governor Pritzker has given hundreds of millions of dollars in tax incentives to PsiQuantum, which is a multi-billion-dollar quantum computing company, and IBM, which we all know is a multi-billion-dollar computing company. The latest announcement this week, another tenant for this quantum and microelectronics planned park on Chicago's southeast side, more than $5 million in tax credits for a computing company called Inflection. So, and there are mixed thoughts on this. There are some who favor this business incentives to grow the economy, and the number of jobs being created doesn't appear to be a lot. I talked with Mark Leonard Wire Points a few months about this, and you're talking about a few dozen here, a few dozen there. These are not, hundreds or thousands of jobs coming into Illinois, and these are quite specific jobs which require a high level of, the people who are working on quantum computers are not, not people like you and me, Greg. They're people who've got some pretty serious, advanced education and training with this type of computing. But the one University of Illinois professor told me this week, this is a Sputnik moment. This is like, quantum is the next, you think back to the internet, or before that to the space age. But boy, a lot of tax incentives being given to these companies, which many of which are already very wealthy, while just a few blocks from this planned park on an abandoned U.S. Steel site on the southeast side of Chicago, you have small businesses really hurting with high taxes. They're just, a mile or two away from the Indiana line, where people flock to get gas and buy goods and services. And so a hard-hit neighborhood resident is very concerned that they're not going to get any benefit from this at all. And so it's, it's something we'll definitely continue to watch. The governor's certainly not slowing down on investing in quantum. Perhaps time will show that these investments will pay off with jobs and growing economies and growing communities. But at this point, it's just, as Mark Lennon said in a conversation, he said, well, that's speculative at this point.
We'll watch that for sure. Something else that might have to actually change our summer plans with, Jim. In the final story here, we've got could we possibly see a special session called by the state legislature or the governor to deal with that fiscal cliff for mass transit across the state of Illinois?
Well, there was a Chicago transit remodernization event this past week where State Senator Mike Simmons of Chicago made the call. I am calling on my colleagues as a state senator, come back to Springfield, have a special session so we can, quote, fully fund public transit. Well, that means, state taxpayer dollars. The measure which didn't pass the state Senate in the spring would have been that very unpopular $1.50 retail delivery tax and real estate transfer taxes. State Senator Don DeWitt told me that that's dead on arrival. Mass transit's dead until on a bipartisan basis we can find solutions that won't put excessive tax burdens on the residents of the state. So we'll keep an eye on it. The governor hasn't ruled out a special session. Speaker Welch didn't seem too interested in it earlier in the summer, but things could change.
Fascinating, especially as they've already got October scheduled, 6 days for 2 weeks in October. But are they going to have to come back in September or even possibly next month? We'll be watching. And if that call is made, we'll be there. All right. Thank you for joining us, Jim. This has been Illinois in Focus, a production of the Center Square. You can listen and keep up with us at thecentersquare.com.